Ferrari had an abysmal Mexican Grand Prix weekend, running miles off the pace and clearly being surpassed by Mercedes as the closest thing Red Bull and Max Verstappen have to a challenge right now. The gap from the front to the red cars of Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc was so big it seemed reminiscent of this time a year ago, when Ferrari had established itself over McLaren as the third fastest team in F1, but didn't yet have the car to take the fight to Red Bull and Mercedes. So why was Mexico such a throwback? No F1 car that's as fast as a Ferrari could suddenly turn that bad overnight in normal circumstances. But as we'll explain in this video, Ferrari wasn't operating in normal circumstances in Mexico City. Ferrari was so far off the pace in Mexico that even if Mercedes was having one of its weaker Grand Prix weekends, it probably would have found itself as the second fastest team by default. Ferrari's plight was slightly exaggerated by the troubled Mercedes, which Lewis Hamilton recently compared to walking up behind a horse and wondering when it's going to kick you, actually getting on quite well with the Mexico City track. There were a few reasons for this. Firstly, the lower air density due to Mexico City's high altitude, over 2,000 meters above sea level, means teams can run maximum downforce levels with very little drag penalty, because there's less air for all the wings and downforce producing parts of the car to cling to. That's good news for Mercedes, as its car is capable of producing a decent amount of downforce, but it's not very efficient, so usually the team struggles for straight line speed because its car is too draggy. The track in Mexico also has a smooth surface, which is just what the W13 needs to stop it kicking the drivers in the face when they walk up behind it. A smooth track means Mercedes can run closer to its optimum ride height without suffering ride quality problems, and that helps the team unlock more of the car's performance that's been so difficult to harness this year. The Mercedes also rode the curbs well, something the Ferrari most definitely did not over the weekend. The result was both Mercedes drivers were in the fight for pole position with the Red Bulls, even if they didn't quite have the pace in race trim to offer Verstappen a real threat for victory. The altitude in Mexico City also played a big part in Ferrari's downfall last weekend, but not for aerodynamic reasons as we've just explained with the Mercedes. In Ferrari's case, the lower air density worked against it and resulted in it having to turn down its engine. Ferrari's turbo layout in its power unit is unique. It has super long inlet tracts, a lower revving MGUH and a smaller turbo, which requires less electrical energy than the other engines to spin up quickly. This usually gives it a significant acceleration advantage out of the corners, even if it comes at a slight price of earlier clipping towards the end of the straight, which is when the battery runs out of energy to deploy and starts harvesting it again. But with 25% lower air density, Ferrari's usual advantage on this front disappeared. With less air to work with, a bigger turbo is needed to work the thinner air harder to generate performance. This didn't just leave Ferrari down on pure engine power. There was a reliability concern here too. Even at the comparably low altitude of the Red Bull Ring earlier this year, Ferrari's turbo ran too fast to make up for the lack of air it was getting, and that was at just under 700 meters above sea level, which resulted in a catastrophic failure in Carlos Sainz's car. Mexico City is more than 3 times higher than Spielberg in Austria, so Ferrari was at far greater risk this time. Other than Ferrari's poor performance, the other noticeable consequence of this for anyone who watched the race on TV and listened to the onboards of the Ferraris was how whiny the turbo sounded whenever the drivers were off the throttle. You could be forgiven for giving your TV set a bash on the side or assuming there was a bug in the F1 audio feed, but nope, that was just how odd the Ferrari sounded because of how its turbo performance was compromised at high altitude. Ferrari knew this was coming, but what it didn't expect was for its car to handle so poorly in Mexico too. It seemed like any time the TV coverage cut to a shot of the Ferrari on track, we'd see either driver constantly being out of shape through the S's, usually when trying to take liberties with the curbs. The drivers were surprised by this. As Sainz put it, altitude shouldn't affect us in terms of cornering speed. Sainz's theory was that the Ferrari wasn't getting on well with the curbs and the team didn't find a sweet spot with the tyres either, while Leclerc complained after qualifying of poor throttle response from the engine, also unsettling his car. For team boss Mattia Binotto, this was the most concerning part of Ferrari's weekend. Binotto said after the race he felt the engine limitations did not explain most of Ferrari's deficit and that Ferrari would have to dig deep for answers on why its chassis performed so poorly because there was no clear explanation. Binotto compared it to Spa, where Ferrari also found itself hopelessly off the pace compared to Red Bull. Given the specifics of the problems in Mexico, it was pretty easy for Ferrari to be frustrated but optimistic it would just be a one-off. And to paraphrase Mercedes team boss Toto Wolff, it's not like Ferrari is suddenly half a minute slower than Mercedes over a race distance when everything is equal. Wolff says we should assess the picture after the Brazilian Grand Prix to get a more accurate read on who Red Bull's closest challenger is. But Sao Paulo is at a slightly higher altitude than the Red Bull Ring, where Ferrari had turbo troubles before, so perhaps it will have to turn its engines down there as well, even if it won't suffer quite as much as it did in Mexico. Maybe there was a more interesting clue in the previous race in the United States. There, Leclerc and Ferrari were praised for a solid recovery from a grid penalty that left him starting 12th to finish on the podium. But did that recovery mask a concerning comparison with Mercedes? The final stint of that race will be remembered for Max Verstappen hunting down Lewis Hamilton and passing him for the win. But what's easy to forget is that after Verstappen's botched pit stop, the Red Bull came out just behind Leclerc's Ferrari, which pitted at the same time. This meant Leclerc was in exactly the same tyre situation as Verstappen with 20 laps to go, and not only could he not keep up with the Red Bull once it passed him for second place, but he couldn't even hang on to Verstappen's coattails enough to make any inroads on Hamilton's Mercedes before the end. Throughout the final stint, the gap between Hamilton and Leclerc hovered around 4 to 5 seconds, and it was only when Hamilton gave up the fight behind Verstappen in the final couple of laps that Leclerc made inroads to finish 2.5 seconds behind the Mercedes. If we're looking for a reason behind this, perhaps Leclerc burned up his tyres more than he would have liked in trying to battle Verstappen early in the stint, and that left him on the back foot for the rest of the race. F1's Pirelli tyres are still incredibly susceptible to suffering a performance drop-off if they are pushed too hard early on, particularly on an abrasive track like Austin. And the US-Mexico back-to-back races are just the latest examples of Ferrari's performance drifting away. The team hasn't won since the middle of July, and while a large part of that can be put down to Red Bull's car getting better and better in the second half of the year, it's worrying for Ferrari that it's not been able to make similar gains. Binotto believes the competitive picture has shifted because Ferrari has stopped developing its 2022 car to switch focus to next year, and he highlighted that Mercedes has kept developing more this year in its bid to get back to competitiveness. The elephant in the room when assessing Ferrari's performance in the second half of the year is the change in the floor flexibility rules that was made over the summer. We're not about to extend this video by another 10 minutes to go over that old ground again, but Ferrari inevitably denies that's had an impact. As for the here and now, Mexico was almost certainly an aberration for Ferrari, but beyond that outlier, the signs are building that it could be shoved back into the role of third wheel at the front of the F1 grid if it doesn't make big strides over the winter.